Today what we're going to do is a few things. We're going to talk about healthcare economics as sort of an application of the kind of stuff we learned about in 1401. We're going to talk a bit about the final, and then I'll leave you a couple minutes at the end to just take time to do your evaluations if you haven't done them yet, to make sure folks get them done. So what we're going to do for most of the lecture is talk about healthcare economics. None of this material will be on the final. This is all just for you to think about kind of a modern policy topic and how you can think about it using kind of some of the tools that are related to what we did in this class. So when we think about healthcare in the US, we have to consider two facts. The first fact is that healthcare in the US is incredibly expensive. So currently in the US, we spend about 17% of GDP on healthcare. That is larger than any other single sector, any other single good. It's bigger than cars, it's bigger than houses, it's bigger than clothing. It's the single expenditure that's the largest in our economy. Yes?
Does that include the insurance stuff you were talking about?
This includes all, this is all health expenditure, so health insurance, healthcare spending, etc. So this is, actually no, let me back up. This does not include insurance. It includes the expenditures covered by insurance. This is all direct healthcare spending. This is also incredibly rapidly growing. In 1950, that's today, in 1950, this was about 4% of GDP. So healthcare is not only growing in dollar terms, it's growing as a share of our economy. The projections, the latest projections are that by the time you guys are retired in 2080, it'll be about 40% of GDP. And that by about 2180, it'll be 100% of GDP. So you should all be doctors. So basically, obviously, this is not sustainable. We are not in a situation where this can be sustained. The question, so one big issue we face in healthcare is what's causing this rise in costs and what should the appropriate policy response, if any, be. One important to note that of the 70% GDP in healthcare, we typically think of Europe as having sort of a government-run healthcare system and us having a private healthcare system. Actually, in the US, virtually half of all healthcare spending is done by the government and about half done by the private sector. So we're about a half and half system. So it's not obvious the solution is more or less government because we're about half and half at this point. So that's one issue. The other issue is that if you look at this money, what are we buying for it? Well, one way to look at that is to recognize that healthcare in 1950 totally sucked. Okay, you guys cannot understand how bad healthcare was not that long ago. Okay, in 1950. In 1950, a baby born was 4 times as likely to die. Actually, given the recent numbers, more than 4 times likely to die in the first year as they are today. If you had a heart attack, you were 4 times as likely to die in the first year after a heart attack as you are today. If you hurt your knee skiing, you guys don't care about babies and heart attacks, you care about skiing. If you hurt your knee skiing, you had surgery, you were in the hospital for a week, you were on crutches for 6 weeks, you had arthritis the rest of your life. Now you hurt your knee skiing, you go in for an hour of outpatient arthroscopic surgery, you come out, you're skiing the next weekend. Okay, maybe the next week, maybe 2 weekends later. Okay? But basically, healthcare is just way, way better. Okay? And we've talked earlier in the course about valuing human life, about talking about the kind of how do you sort of value the gains. We talked about valuing time and valuing life. If you look at typical estimates of what life is worth, typical economists estimates that a year of life is worth about $150,000 to $200,000, that this suggests that the increase in healthcare spending has been worth it. That basically we are so much healthier today than we were in 1950 that actually we are better off as a society spending 17% than we were as a society spending 4%. The easy way economists think of this, here's the way the economists answer the question, does anyone want to go back to 1950s healthcare at 1950s prices? And the answer is no. That's the reveal preference test, that we're happier where we are today than we were in 1950. Okay? That said, those outcomes overall miss enormous heterogeneity in those outcomes. So if you are a white, insured person in a high-income area in America, your healthcare outcomes are by far the best in the world. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Indeed, a simple way to see this, once again, what's the reveal preference test? Every year, about 1 million people come to America to get their medical care. No one leaves. No one goes to France to get surgery. Okay? But French people come here to get surgery. Okay? So if you are in the system and have the resource, the best in the world. But if you're not, our healthcare system is among the worst in the world. So white infant mortality is about the same level as Sweden or Norway. Black infant mortality is twice as high. It's the same level as some poor Latin American countries like Costa Rica or even poorer countries. Okay? We talked about the inequality, difference in mortality between areas 3 miles apart in Baltimore. So the problem in the US is not a problem of people in the system. The problem is not a problem of average outcomes. Actually, our average outcomes sort of justify what we spend. The problem is really twofold. The first problem is a heterogeneity in outcomes, that we've got enormous disparities. So the big problem is healthcare, what we call healthcare disparities. That there's groups in society who are really not benefiting at all from this enormous expenditure. That's problem one. Problem two is that while it's worth it, on average, it's also true that we waste a lot of what we spend. Okay? So if you look, for example, across areas in the US, there are areas that spend very different amounts but have very similar healthcare outcomes. The most famous example of this is a famous article by Atul Gawande in the 2009 New Yorker, a famous one, probably the most famous ever piece of pop healthcare writing. Okay? He wrote an article comparing McAllen, Texas and El Paso, Texas. And what he found here, there are two cities. We got any McAllen Texans here? Okay, so you guys know McAllen and El Paso. Not that different. Southern Texas, not that different sort of places. You know, not identical, but not super different. Similar demographic characteristics. McAllen, Texas had healthcare spending for the Medicare program, that's program of health insurance for the elderly, that was twice as large as El Paso, per person, twice as large, despite the fact that outcomes were no better. Despite the fact people weren't living any longer at McAllen, they spent twice as much, which suggests we're wasting a lot of money. So it suggests while the 17% of GDP may be worth it on average, it's also true that in Europe, where their mortality is about the same, if not lower, they spend 2/3 as much. So we have countries that get the same outcomes 2/3 as much, or areas of America which seem to get the same outcomes spending about 2/3 as much. So the current consensus is of that 17% of GDP, about 1/3 of it's probably not productive in terms of improving health. That about 1/3 of what we spend is actually not improving health. So we've got a situation where, on average, the spending growth has been worth it. So on average, we're better off than we were, but at the same time, there's still substantial inefficiencies. Okay? Still substantial inefficiencies, about 1/3 of what we spend is wasted. Okay? So that's sort of the setup coming in. That's a 7-minute diagnosis of the healthcare system.